Hello, everyone. My name is Norm Burkey, and I am the proud son of Private Norman Burkey, who was killed in World War II. And I'm here today to speak about my dad and our experiences that came out of him losing his life in World War II. I've divided my presentation into three segments. These are strictly relate to what we knew about our dad, and they have no relevance beyond that. The three divisions are the sound of silence, the desert years, and the years of plenty. Despite our circumstances, mainly our limited financial resources, all in all, we had a happy childhood and good and prosperous adult lives. Except for our dad losing his life, our lives were not much different than those that lived around us before, during, and after the war. However, without the support of our extended family, life would have been much more difficult for us. My brother and I also had many positive male role models in our life, but we were missing a dad. Our mom did not remarry and, in fact, never dated anyone. I'll refer to my mom and tell you more about her later in this presentation. I also need to add that this is our experience and is not typical of the experience of other war orphans. I'll also come back to that part later in this presentation. Our family background is poor dirt farmers from the Reading area in the Pennsylvania Dutch country in southeastern Pennsylvania. It's a bit ironic that my dad, who never saw a pair of skis in his life, would end up being assigned to the 10th Mountain Division. Due to alcoholism, there was a great deal of pain in the families of both my paternal grandparents. But my dad seems to have been unscathed by it. My great-grandmother, after giving birth to 4 children, died at an early age when my grandfather was 6 years old. Due to his father's alcoholism, there was a family intervention. The 4 children were split up among relatives. My grandfather and his brother were sent to live with his mom's sister and her husband, who were childless. His older brother was deaf. He and a deaf friend decided to leave home. Unfortunately, they were both killed by a train because they could not hear it coming. My paternal grandmother's father was also a serious alcoholic, and you could immediately spot poor people by their dress back in those days. At this late date in my life, this presentation has given me a much greater appreciation for how much I owe to these people. My mom's family was poor, but her family background was more stable than my dad's. However, we recently learned that my maternal grandfather actually owned a farm, but after the barn burned, he could not afford to rebuild it. So thereafter, he was a sharecropper and had to move his family several times. Our parents, my mom and my dad, were children of the Depression, but somehow our dad managed to graduate from high school, and my mom finished 10th grade. My dad was able to take advantage of the wartime economy, and at the time he was drafted, was working in a defense plant in Reading, Pennsylvania. They started married life living with my dad's family in a small farmhouse without heat or running water. She also had to live with a mother-in-law due to her difficult life, who could be a real burden on her daughters-in-law. I arrived in 1940 and my brother in 1941, but by 1943, they were able to afford to buy a house in a nearby village. That was just in time for my sister to arrive in July of 1943. We've heard 2 versions, but we still don't understand how a man with 3 kids who worked in the defense industry managed to get drafted, but my dad was drafted sometime in April of 1944. He did his basic training at Fort Blanding near Jacksonville, Florida, and then was sent to join the 10th Mountain Division at Camp Swift, just outside of Austin, Texas. The 10th Mountain Division, due to political connections, was formed by the skiing community as an elite volunteer outfit in 1941. However, at that time, the Army had other pressing issues at hand, and as a result, the 10th was sent to Colorado to train, and when they arrived, there wasn't even a base to house them. So except for a disaster event in the Aleutians in 1942, where 11 soldiers of the 10th were killed by friendly fire, the 10th continued to train in Colorado and eventually at Camp Swift in Texas. Some vets told me that the training in Colorado, well, in many ways, was more difficult than the actual combat they faced. At least my dad missed the mountain training in Colorado, and so he was assigned to Company 85C as a BAR man. That's the Browning automatic rifle, if you're not familiar with that term. It's kind of halfway between the rifle and the true machine guns. The 10th Mountain Division left Norfolk, Virginia in January of 45. My dad shipped out on the ship West Point. The 10th Division was assigned to fight the Germans in the hill country north of Florence, Italy. As an interesting note, I didn't know this until I made a trip to Italy, which I'll talk about in a minute, but there was actually a Brazilian battalion on the left of the 10th Mountain Division, and the guys said they weren't much of a fighting outfit, but they were there making their presence known during World War II. We have several pictures of him with an Italian family shortly after they arrived in the hill country. Apparently they were bivouacked in and among Italian families when they first arrived in the hill country. In March 1945, Company 85C helped capture Mount Dell'Espe near the small town of Casteldiano, but while they were under counterattack, he was killed on March 11th. While his buddy had gone back to get some food, an 88 artillery shell hit the tree behind the foxhole, and my dad was killed instantly. We have the exact details of his death, thanks to a book written by two of his comrades after the war. The book is Good Times and Bad Times by John Embry and Hugh Evans. It is a history of Company 85C. Another interesting note is that Bob Dole was injured about a mile from where my dad was killed. However, he was a replacement, and he got injured almost as soon as he arrived on the front, so the 10th Mountain guys never got to know him personally. And so just an interesting sidelight. Although I was 5 when he was killed, I have blanked out memories of that time. I was told that our mom fainted when the news arrived, and I was told much later in life that I was running up and down the street crying for my daddy. With a few exceptions, my childhood memories don't really start until I entered the first grade. Also, my grandfather never attended church again after his son was killed. I think he had just experienced too much pain in his life. Another side note, his dad actually committed suicide in the 1920s, and it fell to my grandfather to make all the funeral and burial arrangements. So, there was my mom, a widow with 3 children at age 26. Now she is both mom and dad, in charge of all the finances and living in a very old house that needed continual repair. She was also in charge of keeping the coal furnace going all winter, and that was a pride thing for her, that the fire never went out. Of course, this also began as soon as our dad left for the Army. We did not have an automobile, so we became totally dependent on others for rides when necessary. My Uncle Paul faithfully picked us up every Sunday to go to Sunday school and church, and my Grandpa Burkey took me and my brother to get a haircut every 2 weeks. We did have a butcher, a baker, a milkman, and a dry cleaner who came through our little town on a regular basis. There was also a bus that came through town and took us each day into the huge city. We thought it was huge at the time, of Reading, Pennsylvania. It's a town of about 100,000 people. We also spent each Sunday afternoon on my Grandpa Miller's farm with our cousins. My mom had 11 sisters and a brother, so it was quite a crowd when everybody came. After we got a bit older, my brother and I spent every other weekend on the Burkey farm with my grandparents, our Uncle John, and sometimes our cousins, Butch and Bobby, where we were expected to help with the farm work. We were also very close to our cousin Jim and spent a lot of time with his family. We were taken once by relatives to Ocean City, New Jersey, but otherwise the highlights of our year were the annual visits to Hershey Park, Pennsylvania by our church and the Reading Fair. I must say that except for a few bleak Christmases, I never really felt that I was particularly deprived. There was also shopping trips to Reading on that bus I just mentioned. Our idea of eating out was a hoagie at the bus stop while we waited for the bus trip home. That was our life. We got more mobile once I was able to drive, but our lives revolved around the local area. Talking about our dad was not taboo, but I cannot recall any instances where people talked about about our dad to us. In fact, I found later in life that one of my best friend's dad was a good buddy of my dad's, but by the time he told me that, his dad was dead. I also had an Uncle Red who was a good friends with my dad, but he wouldn't talk about the World War II at all, although he was a vet, let alone talk to us about our dad. That was even so when our dad was brought back for burial in 1947. But I have to say that even though nothing was ever said about our dad, I think the local community supported us by giving us rides. I can only remember one time when we had to walk home one winter Friday evening. My mom was really a brave person. She allowed me and my brother, we were in junior high school, and we would ride that bus up to the next town, and they had movies on Friday night. So we would get on the bus, go up there, watch the movie, and we had no idea how we were going to get home, but we always managed to find somebody who would give us a ride. There's another sad note to our family history. My Uncle John, our dad's younger brother, met and married a German girl. She and her mother were starving after the war, and my aunt was sent to the U.S. to live with relatives. But she had severe emotional issues all her life and was actually institutionalized several times. She also had to deal with that very unsupportive mother-in-law. So those were the silent years. Now we come to the desert years. The desert years began when college time rolled around. World War II orphans were eligible to go to college under the GI Bill. I graduated from Penn State, and my sister graduated from Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. My brother tried college, but at that time it really wasn't for him. So he eventually was able to make a good career as a pattern maker, working in wood. But even more importantly, he continued to live with my mom in the house our parents bought back in 1943. He devoted himself to our mom, the local volunteer fire company, and later in life was taking courses at the local community colleges. Although she wasn't particularly close to home, my sister also spent a great deal of time helping to take care of her mom. Neither of them ever married, so it came that when we had our kids, that our kids became their kids. My wife and I graduated from college one Saturday, got married the next. We packed all of our belongings in the back of a 1955 Pontiac and had a week to find a place to live in New York City, where I was going to start my career. By 1965, we had our two girls, and were off making a life for ourselves, as were my brother and sister. Fortunately, we always lived close enough to home for regular family visits. due to my being transferred to different cities, but always in the Middle East part of the United States. During those years, our girls grew up, went to college, and got married. My older daughter gave birth to her 4 children, and our younger daughter also gave birth to her son in those years. One comment about my mom: she was a great mom and had a great deal of wisdom. Until her mother-in-law died, she allowed her mother-in-law to tend our dad's grave at the local cemetery. Memorial Day was the only time we had any thoughts about our dad, and those weren't very deep thoughts. We lost our mom in 1995, and now she is buried next to our dad. There were significant years, but frankly, the word dad was not even in our vocabulary of me or my brother or my sister or our mom, really, or any of our relatives, as I mentioned before. So now we come to the years of plenty. The silent years and the desert years came to a sudden halt with a single magazine article. At the time, I was a subscriber to Newsweek. My wife was out of the house, and an article in the back of the current issue caught my attention. As it turned out, it was written by a fellow World War II orphan who actually worked for Newsweek, and it hit me like a bomb. I immediately went into mourning mode, and a whole new life opened for me and my siblings and my family. The article mentioned a group called AWAN. I'll get to them shortly, but also recommended that war orphans contact their dad's association. I should add that perhaps you are aware of this, but most units from all the services established associations after the war, and the 10th Mountain Division was no exception. I immediately looked up the websites for both organizations, that's the 10th and AWAN, and I asked the 10th to put a buddy search item in their next issue of the Blizzard, their newsletter. Almost immediately before their next Blizzard issue was published, I was inundated with cards and letters and phone calls. My oldest daughter, who's a librarian, also found a book by 2 war orphans called Lost in the Victory. It related the experience of many war orphans and was really a boon to my budding education about our dad's time in the service and the results of him being killed. I have to admit that I really didn't take full advantage of the information offers that I got at that time. I was so overwhelmed, I really didn't know what to ask, and by the time I was ready, several of his closest friends were gone. I had built up this fictional account about bad service, and that was not even close to what actually happened to him. For one thing, since he was from Pennsylvania, I just assumed he was with the 28th Division, which is a Pennsylvania division. I'll finish up the 10th Mountain part of the story before moving on to my experience with AWAN. As a prelude, I want to add that several vets who survived World War II were instrumental in starting the ski industry in Colorado. That was after World War II, of course. In fact, the 10th Mountain memorabilia are housed in the Denver Library and the Colorado Historical Society. My wife and I became members of the D.C. chapter of the Descendants Association and immediately made new friends and were able to attend some regional conventions. For tax reasons, there's a 10th Association and a 10th Descendants Organization, but for practical reasons, most of the meetings and conventions included both groups. During the Afghan War, one of my pleasures was driving several of my dad's comrades to Walter Reed Hospital in D.C. to visit some of the current 10th Mountain wounded soldiers who were wounded during the Afghan War. Their camaraderie was immediate, and I know my dad experienced that while he was serving. I'll talk about some common traits of World War II orphans in just a minute, but I also had an experience there. Many of us have this thing that we observe life but we really don't participate in it. And I am one of those types of people. And I continually find myself kind of on the edges of not really joining in what's going on. It's gotten better over the years, but I still experience it. We've also been able to, getting back to the 10th, also been able to attend several national conventions and actually served on a committee that organized a national convention in the DC area way back in 2013. The highlight trip was of the convention was a trip to see the World War II memorial. Uh, and what we did is we loaded all the vets and everybody else on buses and took them down to the World War II memorial. And once the other visitors realized who these guys were, they were immediately surrounded and inundated with well wishes and thanks. An interesting side note, that convention took place actually while the federal government was shut down during one of those battles. But just to make sure there were no problems, we actually had a couple congressmen on the bus with us. But the park rangers just opened the barricades to us, and we had no problem whatsoever. The 10th also began trips back to Italy in the 1960s. They would go every 3 years, and of great importance to us. It was a trip that me and my wife took back to Italy in 2003. The trips all start on Memorial Day in the Florence Cemetery and then proceed to celebrations in several hill towns north of Florence where the 10th did their fighting. A group of Italian World War II reenactors accompany each trip, and although they were aging, they also had a group of Alpinis. They were the guerrilla fighters, the Italian guerrilla fighters who are helping fight the Germans. In fact, they were fighting even before the 10th got there. John Embry and Hugh Evans, the guys I mentioned before, and several other people connected with 85C were on that trip. John Embry was able to point out the route that they took up to Mont Delespée to take the mountain from the Germans. And Hugh Evans, on a side trip on Wednesday of that trip, was able to locate the foxhole where my dad was killed. I actually have a picture of me in the foxhole where my dad was killed. Another interesting thing that happened on that trip is we were in this small town being entertained by the locals, and we met this lady from Long Island. And she was visiting her Italian family at that time and came out for the celebration. And as it turned out, her brother was one of those World War II nuts. We gave him a copy of a picture of the Italian family I mentioned earlier in the presentation, but we never heard from him, so we assumed that he was not able to locate the family. In fact, he wanted me to get in his car and go right then to start driving around trying to locate the family. I need to start to talk about this group that I owe so much. That's AWON, or the American World War II Orphans Network. We are all orphans and family members of men who were killed during World War II. I don't have a lot of time to tell you about its founding, but it's interesting that we all came to our interest in AWON in our late 40s and 50s. When I was younger, I just wouldn't have been interested, mainly due to time constraints. I was busy with my family and my career. There were no records kept, but an estimate based on the number of orphans receiving benefits from the Veterans Department, it's like more than a guesstimate. It's that World War II produced about 183,000 orphans. We at AWON have located maybe 3,000, but even at our height when the World War II memorial was completed, we never reached 1,000 in membership. It is amazing to a lot of us, but some orphans are simply not interested in their dads. I had a personal experience with that myself. So AWON can briefly be described as a Gold Star group on steroids. Simply put, it's all about our dads. One of our early members coined the phrase the wall of silence, and that is what many of us experienced, including me. And no one talked to us about our dads, and that was certainly my experience as I related early in my talk. That was not universal, but it was pretty common. So when we meet a new member after hello, the next few words are almost always, "Tell me about your dad." I just had that experience at church just a few months ago. I learned that a lady I go to Sunday school with had a dad who was killed in World War II, and after we introduced ourselves, she immediately started telling me all about her dad. And of course, that's what I was interested in hearing about. Now, relationships with moms are a bit more complicated, a more complicated issue, and there really isn't time to address them here. As we know, many of the World War II vets came back with what we now call PTSD. We had an experience of that in our family, and this produced many unhappy marriages and lots of family dysfunction. So just like the World War II vets, we are slowly fading away. Very few of our children are interested in maintaining A1. But in our heyday, we had regional gatherings. We had one in York, Pennsylvania, every April. Many of those continue to this day. And we also had national gatherings every 2 years. They continue. There was just one in New Orleans last year. We had them across the country. We would rotate to east, to central, to west, and back again. But we needed a local core group to organize the conventions, but it was also always under the supervision of our board of directors. We also continue to publish our newsletter called The Star. Some of my A1 sisters actually ended up running their dads' associations when the vets were no longer able to do it. But as you probably know, there are very few World War II vets still with us. So the highlights of our national gatherings were what we call the sharing circles. We broke into small groups, and everyone got a turn to talk about their dads. These were always very emotional events, lots of Kleenex boxes on the table, and our spouses had a separate event where they could talk about what it was like to live with a war orphan. We also brought in guest speakers to our conventions. We always had a rep from a group in Hawaii that recovers the remains from all wars. In fact, I think maybe they've been moved to the United States now. And additionally, one of our war orphans is married to a world-famous psychiatrist. His name is Vamek Volkan. He was at the University of Virginia. He's retired now. And his specialty was mourning. And he always made a presentation at our national conferences. And one thing I learned from him is that if we mourn as a child, we need to re-mourn as an adult. And that's certainly been my experience. Yeah, in my life, the experience I had. There is a U.S. cemetery in Margraten, Holland. Maybe you've heard about it. All the graves in Margraten have been adopted by Dutch families, and they keep passing it down to the newer generations. Many of our orphans have traveled to Holland and to Normandy for Memorial Day. A special bond has developed between the Dutch families and several of our A1 members. In fact, at our 2018 conference in Washington, D.C., a Dutch men's choir paid their own way just to come and sing for us. Very emotional a time for both groups. Our members have also made trips to the Pacific to visit the places where their dads fought and died. On their last visit, they discovered the mile markers for the death march, the Bataan Death March, were in bad shape. So they raised enough money among themselves and they had them replaced. It was my privilege, most of the time, I have to say, to serve on the board of directors of A1 for a bunch of years. One thing I learned from my corporate training days was group dynamics, and we had some catchwords for groups. Groups form, then they storm, then they reform, and actually, hopefully, perform. There were days when I thought we would never get past the storming part in A1, but our shared sense of purpose always allowed us to survive and, for the most part, to prosper. I will always be indebted to A1 for giving my dad back to my family. There is this group, I think you may have heard of them, called the Friends of the World War II Memorial, that arranges for continuous events and activities at the memorial. The executive director, Holly Rotundi, and the A1 board of directors have developed a special relationship over the years. In May 2016, Mother's Day and VE Day fell on the same day, and Holly put out the word that she would like somebody to come and talk to the group gathered at the World War II Memorial to talk about their mom. I didn't put the word out to anybody. In A1, I immediately accepted on my own behalf, and it was a great privilege. What a great mom we had. And my brother and sister, thanks to the generosity of the friends, they were able to attend also. And I was able to thank them publicly in front of everybody to tell them how much I appreciated how they cared for our mom until her passing. A final note about the memorial. Our founder, Annie Mix, a force to be reckoned with, somehow was able to join the organizing group. And some of the members of the committee, including her, wanted the names of the war dead to be named individually on a continuous loop. That wasn't really feasible, so the compromise was the stars that are at the memorial, each one of the stars representing 10,000 of those who died as a result of the World War II conflict. Just a final thought, another interesting note. Something I learned at my time and with A1, there's actually a group in England called GI Trace, and they were formed to find the fathers of the children born to the fathers and British girls while the GIs were stationed in England, mainly prior to the invasion in France in 1944. An interesting group. And we have been able to find some of their stories over the years. Very meaningful, very moving, but some of them, frankly, very sad too. So, finally, I say thank you, Holly, once again for giving me this awesome opportunity to talk about my dad and my mom. So that's what I have to say, and I can now turn it over to any questions that you might have for me. Thank you.